Well, with the current rental crisis leading to skyrocketing rental prices across the country and many unable to find accommodation at all, how do you propose we support young people and those doing full-time study to find affordable accommodation?
Stephen.
We've got a housing crisis in the country and it stems from the fact that we don't have enough houses. So our policy, and we'll be legislating our $10 billion housing fund in the Parliament this week, our policy is all directed at building more houses at every end of the market, but particularly social and affordable housing, so that young people such as yourself, I assume, are attending university or aspiring to, can find a rental property near or in the same area where you're going to university. When you finish university, you get a job, you're able to afford to buy a house in the area where you're working. And that right throughout the area of the housing market, we have more houses available at every area within the market. It's going to take a while. We've just got to be honest with people.
Is that going to make rental more affordable, though? Because the houses you're talking about are houses for people to purchase as well. You're talking about an extra houses, but you're looking at, what, 10,000 homes? It won't start until mid-next year. What does that do right now for people who are struggling to pay rent?
You're right, Stan. The reality is this should have been started a decade ago. It wasn't. Whenever we start, it's going to take time. We are still living in the shadow of the COVID economy, where supply chains have been fractured. We've got skill supply shortages. We've got building supply shortages. So even if we wanted to turn it on and say, let's build 10,000 houses within the next 6 months, that's a promise that we couldn't deliver.
And you also can't promise to keep rent down, can you?
Well, no, we can't promise to keep rent down, but what we know is unless we do the things that are contained within our housing policy, the problems you describe are going to get worse. So at the very minimum is ensuring the situation doesn't get worse, and working with the state and territory governments, which is why we've formed a housing accord, and is why we know that we've got to get every link in the chain sorted out, whether it's planning decisions and ensuring we're bringing new developments onto the market, ensuring that we get new supply onto the market, and ensuring that from the federal government, the levers that we have, which are funding levers, they're all working in unison. But, you know, I'm not going to say to you or anyone else we can turn this around overnight, but whenever we start, it's going to take a while.
Josh, your situation, you're studying at the moment. I believe you're living at home, right?
Yeah, so I feel myself, I'm lucky, you know, to be from a family living near where I am on placement as a fifth-year medicine student.
But could you move out? Could you afford to move out?
I think balancing university commitments and work, supporting yourself, it does become very challenging. We're seeing amongst our peers at the moment having to offer $100+ over what's requested for their weekly rent to be able to secure a property. I think this is particularly true for students from regional, remote areas, rural areas, Indigenous communities, as well as those from interstate and international students from overseas. So I guess any suggestions to help resolve those issues for those communities.
And you raised questions about the most vulnerable and Indigenous communities. What's the situation for Indigenous families trying to rent, Catherine?
Oh, I tell you what.
Let alone get a mortgage.
I'll tell you what, it's a funny conversation to be having in Australia, because in regional and remote areas, particularly in Indigenous communities, we've been in housing crisis for decades. We've been screaming about this for decades, and when our children come into universities, many of them have to come interstate, and they're coming from families that absolutely have no capacity to offer additional support while you're there. We know that things like ab study don't cover the rent. They really don't, not in this environment. And we know they barely pay for your food, and yet the way the red tape exists around things like ab study and Oz study means it is very, very difficult to work simultaneously, because it's an uncertain market. You don't know what your shifts are going to be. You're not in full-time employment. You're constantly answering to what you might think you might earn, and tell you what, if you get it wrong, you're going to get smashed by Centrelink. It is an awful time to be trying to find appropriate accommodation for anyone who's in a vulnerable situation. For our families in the bush, it's a nightmare. It is an absolute nightmare. And when we look at things like the rising price of energy, the rising costs, the escalation of prices in remote and regional areas is ridiculous. Those communities have been paying $5 a litre for fuel for a very long time, $40 for a pumpkin.
$5 a litre?
Absolutely. I saw a photo once of a pumpkin for $40 while those communities are sitting there living off Centrelink, and they're living off Centrelink because we never put the investment into community development, economic development. The jobs aren't there. So you have all those stresses, but it's interesting, if I go back to the original question, one of the things that I've heard recently is actually for mainstream Australia, it's not a housing shortage, it's a bedroom shortage, and that's because we haven't looked at things like negative gearing, where we have very, very wealthy people that might own, 20 plus properties with multiple bedrooms, and they're not selling it because we've made it too expensive to sell, right? So we know that housing costs together, prices might be dropping, you might lose $200,000 on a house, but the cost of sale offsets that, so people don't want to give it up. So there potentially is something to be looking at in that space as well.
Well, and we know that's Stephen. When it comes to negative gearing, that's the third rail, right? You don't want to touch taxation and negative gearing. We know that's been the case. We won't go back and revisit the 2019 election when you went down that road. But Behrouz, what about for refugees as well? The situation that refugees face, particularly people, and we're going to come to this issue a bit later, but particularly people on temporary protection visas in trying to secure some form of consistent and affordable housing?
Yeah, I think we will get back to refugees. We will talk about refugees, but actually, to be honest, since I've been here in Australia, I've been here, I came here last month, and I've been in shock to see homeless people on the street in this country. And I understand Australia through my experience, while I was in Manus Island and I was looking at Australia. And I think you should be very angry, and I'm angry as well, instead of these politicians, that they are talking about housing, but actually they've spent more than $14 billion in those islands. And that money went to the pocket of security companies. And now, I find it ridiculous that last week, this government made a contract with an American company with $420 million just to keep 70 people in Nauru. And those people are in Nauru for almost 10 years. So I think you should ask this question, how they waste this money, and they should be accountable. They should answer that how they use this money, Of course, we will get back to human rights abuse and what this government has done, both political parties, but I think they should answer that how they wasted this money. And that company...
I'll give Stephen Jones a quick reply to this, and then we are going to revisit this issue a bit more substantially later, but just a quick response to Behrouz.
Firstly, I want to acknowledge your own lived experience. We inherited contracts, we've renewed them. We will ensure that there continues to be an offshore processing facility as a part of our border protection policies, but it is our objective to ensure that there's nobody there. There are over 140 people in Nauru. When we obtained government, there are less than 65 people there today.
Okay,
our objective is to get that to zero.
We are getting ahead of ourselves, but Behrouz is going to be in Canberra tomorrow talking specifically about this. Your objective is to get it to zero when?
Our objective is to get it to zero over the course of this year through the processes that we have been accelerating, mainly through ensuring that these people have third country settlements, whether it's New Zealand, whether it's the United States. But they will come to Australia first, mainland, before they're given third country settlement? Some of those details will have to be worked out, but my understanding with the Immigration Minister, my understanding is directly a direct transfer to the third. So
they will not be coming to mainstream Australia. They will stay in offshore detention
Yes,
until they go to a third. Is
until
that
they are.
Yeah,
until they are
actually here
transferred
I'm
to a
not
third
talking
country.
about human rights in this.
I know the point.
I will get back to human rights, and everyone know that what Australia has done, how Australia has created a tragedy. But now, for that particular question, I am asking about money. What are you going to do with $420 million in that island just to keep 70 people in that island? How you want to use that money?
Well, the objective actually.
Yeah, just answer that.
I do. Thank you, and again, acknowledging your experience there, and we would rather you
No,
weren't
I'm
there
not
at
talking
all.
about
I know
my
you're not, but
experience now. I'm talking
I don't want
as
to be
a,
dismissing that.
I'm talking as
Let
a
me be very clear.
political
Our
person,
objective is to have nobody there. Our objective is to have nobody there, but to continue to
But the
have a
money?
facility there as a deterrent and to be used as necessary. But our objective is to have nobody there, or if anybody is there, they're there for a very short period of time until a third country settlement arrangement can be put in place.